Hi, everyone. I have a sick child and can't be there with you, but I'm going to give you an overview of our project from here on Treaty 6 territory. My name is Renee Beausoleil. I use the pronouns she, her. I'm housed and I have English and French settler heritage. I'm working on my PhD in political science at the University of Alberta. I was actually born in North York and spent most of my childhood on Anishinaabe territory, but I did not know that at the time. I remember one day when I was working at University of Victoria, running into my colleague, Dr. John Burrows, a world-renowned Anishinaabe legal scholar. It came up that I'd grown up in Barrie and went to a Sikanak public school, and John told me a Sikanak means blackbird and Anishinaabe moyen. I was struck that I had gone to that school for 12 years, cheering for the so-called Sikanak chiefs without knowing the meaning of this word. And I remember going back to my office and rapidly researching and learning that a Sikanak was also an esteemed chief. I was at the time coordinating an Indigenous law project with a partner in John's home community, Miashinaming, quite near Barrie. And so I was doing that work, but at the same time, I had so much to learn about my own connection to the territory. It's a moment where the erasures caused by colonialism were really real for me. And that's why I'm telling you this story, to locate myself and ground my territorial acknowledgement of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, on whose lands CAEH is gratefully gathered today. My PhD project, called Home in the City, brings together work I had done with advocacy groups downtown Victoria and work I had done as the coordinator of the UVic Indigenous Law Research Unit, which we call ILRU. With ILRU, I coordinated projects with Indigenous communities, revitalizing Indigenous laws, especially a large national project on harms and conflicts. At the same time, in 10 years of advocacy work in Victoria, I witnessed harm and conflicts caused by the impacts of colonialism, gender, class, and ability. And my dream for my PhD project was to bring together lessons from both these areas of my life. The purpose of what became the Home in the City project was to organize workshops focused on the informal aspects of governance that start with our relationships with one another, especially building horizontal relationships and responding to conflict. The goal was to develop principles and processes for shared decision-making while being conscious of differences in positionality and lived experience. The main activity of Home in the City involved the creation of the Victoria Declaration, which is a set of principles and actions for collaborative governance and housing community. And our process led to a method of community-engaged governance that I refer to as practical governance. This is when a researcher works with diverse community to co-create governance resources. It also builds practices of community decision-making in the process itself. A group of over 50 people gathered for our first meeting, and they were dedicated to crafting a shared statement. The project ended up extending beyond the initial plans, which was made possible by material support from the Greater Victoria Coalition to End Homelessness and the UVic Indigenous Law Research Unit, which was really important because I was out of the very small budget I had initially had for my PhD research. The sessions were facilitated by myself and Matthew Wildcat from Ermineskin Cree Nation, who brought his knowledge of relational governance. In the end, about 35 of the initial 55 participants were part of the follow-up and review meetings. Our group included advocates, service providers, and up to half the group are people with lived and living experience of homelessness. Also, about half the participants identified as Indigenous people, which brought important perspectives to this project. Throughout this presentation are photos used with permission that give you a visual of the actual decision-making involved in the practical governance method. At the end of the first meeting, everyone was asked to write down 2 main takeaways on individual cards. Here's a small group reviewing the cards and discussing what ideas go together. The idea with practical governance is to build our capacity to make collaborative decisions about community issues, centering individuals who access services in governance decision-making and support decolonizing governance processes. As a non-Indigenous researcher, it was important for me to be accountable to Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people, both the process and the outcomes. This included collaborating with Indigenous community members and Indigenous organizations, and I reached out to local First Nations to share the vision and intent for the project. I also kept collaborators updated with the process and the results. As mentioned, Matt Wildcat and I co-led the sessions. We also had co-facilitators from ILRU who brought discussions of Indigenous law into every session. ILRU also ran a 2-day downtown Indigenous laws workshop. And reflecting these discussions, the first commitment in the declaration asked signers to make space for services informed by Indigenous laws, but in the context of long-term reciprocal relationships. That work of building services informed by Indigenous laws, it's happening. It's being led by others. And our aim was to build our capacity to be supportive of that work and, where appropriate, over the long term. Here's something I'd like to emphasize for perhaps mainly other non-Indigenous people in the audience. On the one hand, there's work you can do towards reconciliation, towards decolonizing yourself and your work. And on the other hand, sometimes the most important thing is to make space for Indigenous people who are already doing certain work. It's a careful balance that needs to be walked with respect and in relationship. When we decided to apply to give this presentation, we didn't know we would be put on a panel about reconciliation, but what I knew was I wanted to think about how we centered lived experience and also think about when someone like me, housed, white, middle class, I don't have certain lived experience. And we need to do the work of deep listening. That's a term I learned from philosopher James Tully. And for me, and it's about listening in a way where you're willing to potentially be changed by what it is you hear. And for me, that means we must also transform the ways governance takes place. So that's work for all of us. Home in the City was co-led by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but I want to recognize my co-panelists who are leading work by and for Indigenous people. Also, Fran Hunt-Janucci, who heads up the Aboriginal Coalition to End Homelessness in Victoria, supported me to do this work from even before I started. In fact, she hired me to support my relationship building, and I first met Janine at one of her gatherings. But ultimately, the Aboriginal Coalition, other groups in Victoria, Indigenous outreach workers, iHeart, these are the leaders of this work in our community. The last thing I'll say about accountability, I learned from Val Napoleon, a Cree legal scholar. The realities of oppression must be the acknowledged context that we are working in. And at the same time, gathering stories of trauma and pain does not need to be our focus. We wanted individuals to have space to speak from experience, and we also focused on the ways these difficult community realities can inform our governance responses. Key impacts. Although much of our work was relationship building and governance practice, our main tangible outcome was the co-creation of the Victoria Declaration. It was signed by the Coalition to End Homelessness back in September 2019. We had a community signing event that was planned for spring 2020, and that and some of our other work was stalled due to the pandemic. However, this spring, someone from a group called NSUN, Neighbors in Solidarity with Unhoused Neighbors, saw the declaration on Janine's email signature, and some members of their group were able to say, yeah, I was part of making that. This group ended up organizing a declaration reboot and catalyzed a bunch of new energy to get signers and work towards implementation. This fall, Greater Victoria Acting Together endorsed and incorporated the declaration into their housing campaign. And just a few weeks ago, the Victoria City Council passed a motion to endorse the declaration. We are very happy to say. So now I'm grateful to turn things over to Janine, who will tell you more about how she and other inclusion team members and living experience council have been putting the declaration to work in policy and practice. Thanks, everyone.